Tonight we step quietly into the cavernous belly of a Tudor Great Hall, and the air is thick with the scent of last night's roasted meats, smoke clinging stubbornly to the rafters as if it had signed a long lease. You hear the creak of oak beams and the faint echo of your own footsteps across the stone floor. Somewhere nearby, a dog shifts and lets out a sigh that sounds suspiciously like disappointment in your choice of footwear. In this strange chamber, you'll notice something unusual. People bedding down not on beds, not even on straw pallets in tucked-away chambers, but right here, beneath the very tables that only hours ago hosted platters of venison, trenchers of bread, and tankards of ale. You're watching the servants of the Tudor household crawl into their nightly burrows, vanishing into the shadows under massive oak boards that stretch the length of the hall. You probably wouldn't survive this, by the way. Not a night of sleeping on stone in the middle of drafty England with only the underside of a table as your ceiling. Your back would protest, your neck would file a complaint with human resources, and by dawn you'd be coughing up soot from the great hearth. Still, for these servants, it wasn't misery. It was just Tuesday. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at one end of the long hall, where banners hang limp, their colours faded by years of swoken grease. This is the heart of a Tudor household, the public and private sphere mashed together like yesterday's pottage. In daylight it was the stage for ritual meals, announcements, and the subtle chess game of hierarchy. By night, however, the grand hall was transformed into something humbler, a kind of makeshift dormitory for the lowest ranks of the household. The great oak tables, those heavy slabs with trestle legs that took 3 men and possibly a saint to move, became the roofs of tiny shadowed dwellings. Why here? Well, a Tudor household ran like a small village. Hundreds of bodies needed food, work and our rest. And yet a lord's house was designed less for comfort and more for spectacle. Private chambers were precious real estate, reserved for nobility and high-ranking guests. Beds themselves were luxury items, expensive, ornate, and sometimes even carried from house to house when a family travelled. You, as a servant, had no such privilege. Instead, your body became another piece of furniture to be arranged out of the way, and the safest, warmest, and most convenient slot available was beneath the dining tables. It wasn't entirely foolish either. Tables provided a degree of shelter, oak boards overhead to keep falling ash or dripping candle wax off your face, trestle legs forming a sort of protective frame. A curious modern comparison might be children making a blanket fort, except here your fort smells of stale ale and goose fat. And unlike a child, you're expected to leap out the instant the bell is rung, or a master snaps his fingers. There's also the practical fact that Tudor great halls were enormous and draughty. The fire in the hearth gave off heat, but also smoke, sparks, and occasional flying embers. Sleeping out in the open would leave you coughing or singed, but curling up under the table's shadow gave you a pocket of relative calm. Historians still argue whether servants did this every night or only in crowded households, but the evidence suggests it was common enough to be remarked upon. Think of it as part of the choreography of Tudor life. The day belonged to the lords, the night belonged to the servants, and the same space had to bend to both. The soundscape would be strange. Snores, muttered dreams, the rustle of dogs scratching fleas beside you, the drip of wax from a guttering candle, and the ever-present groan of wood beams settling. Someone coughs into the darkness, another shifts, and then silence returns, thick, communal, oddly comforting. Privacy was practically non-existent. The closest you might get to solitude was choosing the right corner beneath the trestle leg and hoping the kitchen boy didn't drool in your direction. And yet, there's a quiet dignity to it. Imagine yourself lying there, the smell of oak above, the cold stone below, the muted light of embers painting the rafters in a soft orange glow. You might resent the stiffness of your sleeping place, but you're also snug in a way, protected by the Lord's roof, fed from his kitchen, and folded into the routine of a household that pulsed like a living organism. Of course, not everyone viewed it so romantically. Some visitors were scandalized, scribbling in their journals about the undignified heaps of servants sprawled under tables like cattle. Others barely noticed, taking it as the natural order of things. Lords above, servants below, and oak tables between them like a symbolic divider. Furniture wasn't just furniture in Tudor England, it was a marker of rank, and even in sleep the hierarchy pressed down literally on those beneath. This is your first glimpse into why Tudor servants slept under tables, a mixture of necessity, hierarchy, practicality, and a touch of superstition about safety in shadowed wood. You're only beginning to see how the nightly ritual spoke volumes about an age obsessed with order and display, where even dreams had to respect the furniture plan. You keep your place in the dim hall, noticing now how every figure's sleeping spot is carefully, almost obsessively assigned by invisible rules. The Tudor world was obsessed with hierarchy, and that obsession didn't take the night off just because everyone needed to sleep. You, as a lowly servant, weren't free to flop down wherever you fancied. No, where you rested was dictated by your position in the household chain, a ladder that was steeper and slipperier than any spiral stair. At the very top of this ladder, of course, were the lord and lady of the house. They had private chambers, often upstairs, well away from the clamour of dogs, smoke and snoring. These rooms might contain carved beds with heavy curtains, feather mattress, and even warming pans slid under the sheets before bedtime. A chamber like that was less a room and more a public statement, a soft, perfumed fortress of wealth and authority. You, however, as a scullery boy or maid of all work, would be lucky if your blanket wasn't just an old cloak that smelled like onions. Between lord and servant stretched a whole sliding scale of privilege. Gentlemen retainers or high-ranking stewards often had small chambers off the hall or above it. Semi-private niches reached by creaky staircases. Lesser officials might claim a pallet in the gallery, or near the buttery, close enough to hear the rattle of cups at dawn. But the true bottom rung, that was yours, under the table, where you lay side by side with kitchen lads, grooms, and sometimes even beggars taken in for the night. Imagine the unspoken rule book. If you peel vegetables, you're near the salt barrel. If you tend horses, you're closer to the draught from the door. If you're lowest of all, under the table you go. It may sound bleak, but to the Tudor mind it was simply order. Just as no one would dare sit at the high table without rank, no one would dare claim a privileged corner for sleeping. You belonged under the furniture as surely as the family silver belonged locked in the chest. Historians still argue whether this was strictly enforced, or if some servants snuck closer to warmth when no one was watching, but the official idea of sleeping hierarchy fit neatly into the broader social order. Everyone had their place, even in dreams. And then, of course, there's the comic detail that some lords employed servants known literally as bedchamber lads, who were expected to sleep in the same room as their masters, not under the table, but at the foot of the bed like faithful watchdogs. If you think your boss emailing at midnight is bad, imagine him calling your name from the bed curtains and expecting you to leap up with a candle and a chamber pot. Suddenly, a table roof seems almost luxurious. There's also the constant presence of animals. Dogs often curled beneath tables during feasts, happily snapping up fallen morsels. When the hall turned into a dormitory, those dogs simply shifted from begging scraps to snoring bedfellows. You'd feel their warmth beside you, hear their growls in sleep, and occasionally get a paw in the ribs. Hierarchy didn't care about dogs. They shared the same shadowy space, and no servant dared push them out. You might joke to yourself that at least the dog didn't outrank you, though in truth the Lord's favourite hound sometimes did. Modern ears might expect rebellion. Why didn't the servants complain, refuse, demand better? But survival in Tudor England meant obedience. The same culture that drilled order into table manners drilled it into sleeping habits. Complaining wasn't just risky, it was pointless. Where else would you go? The inn down the road would cost more than your wages, and the ditch outside would guarantee frostbite. Better to curl under the oak trestle and remind yourself that tomorrow at least brings bread and ale. And so, as you lie in that cramped space, your back pressed to stone, you become part of a rigid yet strangely stable hierarchy. It is written into the air you breathe, the food you eat, the very boards above your head. Every snore and shuffle in the dark is a quiet reminder. In Tudor England, even in sleep, the social ladder never let you forget your rung. Your eyes adjust to the gloom beneath the long oak trestle, and you start to see why these tables, more than just eating surfaces, became makeshift shelters. They were not the dainty dining tables of modern apartments, no collapsible IKEA legs or polished veneers here. Tudor tables were slabs, heavy as gravestones, carved from oak that might have been standing in Sherwood Forest when your great-grandfather was born. To move one took 3 strong backs and a prayer, and to crawl beneath one was to step into a pocket of architecture, a shadowy alcove supported by solid timber. The table wasn't merely a roof, it was a fortress. The boards overhead stopped candle wax from dripping into your hair, and the thick legs shielded you from the accidental kick of a stumbling drunkard making his way to the privy at midnight. If you were very lucky, the trestle legs created a kind of private cell, where your corner was defined by wood instead of just air. Compared to sprawling openly across the flagstones, it was downright snug. You might joke that it was the Tudor equivalent of bunk beds, except instead of climbing upward you tucked yourself downward. There was also a superstition, half-whispered, that wood was a protector. People believed oak absorbed bad humours, and that spirits or witches were less likely to bother those who slept shielded by timber. Whether you believed it or not, you'd probably sleep a little easier under the great table, knowing something solid stood between you and the rafters where bats or worse might flutter. Historians still argue whether these beliefs genuinely shape sleeping habits or whether practicality alone explains the choice, but it's hard not to imagine some servant muttering, "Better under oak than under nothing." The table also guarded against one of the hall's greatest enemies, draughts. Tudor houses were notorious for their breezes, the kind that slipped under doors, whistled through cracks, and carried the chill of the English night straight into your bones. Beneath the table you were spared some of that invisible current. The air felt stiller, like a small cave, and even a few degrees warmer could mean the difference between rest and shivering. You pressed your cloak closer, pulled your knees to your chest, and felt the table trap your body heat like a crude canopy. Practical though it was, there was something humbling about turning grand furniture into shelter. During the feast, the same table gleamed with pewter plates, pitchers of ale, and joints of roasted meat carried in with pomp. Lords and ladies sat high, carving into venison while musicians played. Then the banquet ended, the platters scraped clean, and before dawn the same structure became your bedroom ceiling. You could almost laugh at the irony. By day the table declared your inferiority, and by night it gave you shelter. Perhaps you whispered a thank you to the wood, or perhaps you grumbled that even in dreams you couldn't escape your master's leftovers. There's also the animal factor. Dogs loved the underside of tables. They claimed the space during meals, waiting for scraps. And when you crept under at night, you were effectively intruding into canine real estate. The dog, of course, didn't care about your rank, only about whether you smelled of food. On a good night, its warmth was welcome. On a bad one, its fleas were less so. You could call it shared housing, though the landlord barked at passing shadows. The fringe tidbit here is that some households apparently designated certain tables as permanent servant shelters, moving benches aside at night so there was room for curled bodies. It's a detail rarely mentioned in official records, but hinted at in letters and plays of the period. Imagine a massive oak trestle, its primary function to hold mutton and pies, secondarily to host the dreams of half a dozen weary kitchen hands. That's efficiency, Tudor recycling at its finest. So when you think of why Tudor servants slept under tables, it isn't just poverty or inconvenience. It's that the tables themselves offered practical protection, a sense of shelter, and maybe even a touch of superstitious comfort. In a world where your survival depended on any scrap of warmth and safety you could claim, an oak roof, even one that doubled as the nobleman's dinner stage, was better than no roof at all. You stir a little, shifting your stiff shoulders under the oak, and it becomes clear that the table wasn't only about shelter, it was about service. You were never just a sleeper in this house. You were an extension of your master's will. To lie beneath the table was to remain within reach, literally on call through the night, like a human fire alarm and a walking, yawning service bell. Tudor lords liked their comforts at odd hours. Imagine the master of the house waking at midnight with a cramp or a craving, coughing loudly until some servant popped his head from under the table like a mole in a meadow. "Fetch more ale," he might growl, and up you'd scramble, shaking straw from your hair and rushing off to the buttery. Or perhaps the lady wanted the fire stirred, her feet warmed, or the chamber pot attended. Servants were expected to spring into action no matter the hour. Sleeping beneath the hall table wasn't just about lacking beds, it was about being strategically placed so you could respond before the Lord even finished calling. And if you think this sounds exhausting, you'd be right. Modern workers might complain about being on call through their smartphones, but you, under that oak trestle, were the original push notification. Every cough, every creak of floorboard above could yank you from a half-dream into a task. You might joke grimly that Tudor sleep was more of a nap with interruptions than a full night's rest. Historians still argue whether every household truly kept servants so immediately available, or if it was more common only in the grandest estates. But the pattern of expectation runs throughout Tudor culture. Those at the bottom are never free of duty. This proximity also ensured you were seen. If the master rose early or returned late, he didn't have to wonder where his people were. He stepped into the hall and there you were, a pile of bodies reminding him that his household was alive, ready, and bound to him. To sleep elsewhere would be almost rebellious, a statement that you could remove yourself from his orbit. Under the table, however, you remained orbiting like a moon around a planet, predictable, obedient, and, unfortunately, cold. There's an odd tidbit tucked into some accounts. Certain households apparently had servants tasked with waking others at precise times, essentially human alarm clocks. A boy under the table might be nudged awake at 3 to stoke the fire, then he'd rattle his friends awake at 4 to prepare bread, and so on. Imagine the ripple effect, like dominoes of drowsy teenagers forced upright, one after the other, while the gentry slept blissfully on feather beds upstairs. This wasn't just sleeping under a table, it was being part of a living machine that ticked through the night. And here's where superstition enters again. Some masters believed servants should remain close not only for utility but for protection. Evil spirits, it was thought, might target a great house at night, but a hall full of bodies, even weary ones, would deter mischief. A lone noble upstairs, cut off, might be vulnerable. But a noble with 20 sleepers under the tables in the hall below was surrounded, fortified by human presence. You weren't just a servant, you were a kind of spiritual buffer. Lucky you. Of course, humour is the servant's coping mechanism. You might mutter to your neighbour, "If I'm expected to leap up every time the master sneezes, at least let me dream I'm in a feather bed while I wait." The joke would draw a muffled chuckle, a moment of shared rebellion in the dark before you both returned to listening for the next summons. So yes, servants slept under tables because they had no better place, but also because their bodies were woven into the household's nightly rhythm. You weren't there to rest fully. You were there to remain available. You were living furniture, part of the machinery of service expected to blend seamlessly with the oak above you. The table wasn't just a shelter, it was your station, your post, your tether to a life of perpetual readiness. The stone under your hip aches, and you begin to realise that one of the main reasons for hiding under the table wasn't just social hierarchy or readiness, it was the bitter, bone-deep cold of Tudor nights. A great hall might look majestic by daylight, all banners and beams, but at night it turned into a cavern of draughts, every gust of wind looking for a gap to squeeze through. The walls, often built of stone, held the chill like an icebox. Windows, if they had glass at all, were thin, bubbled and leaky. Doors never quite shut flush. A hall in winter was less a home and more an elaborate refrigerator with a fire in the middle. The hearth itself was enormous, built to roast whole oxen, but the heat it threw out was unpredictable. Stand right in front of it and you'd be singed like bread left too long on a spit. Take a step back and the cold would swoop in like a greedy crow. Sparks popped, smoke billowed, and the warmth never quite reached the far ends of the hall. You, shivering in your thin woolen tunic, knew that finding a nook under the table was the closest thing to insulation you'd get. The wood created a still pocket, a breakwater against invisible rivers of cold air. Historians still argue whether servants clustered under tables primarily for warmth or for order, but it seems obvious that survival had something to do with it. Tudor winters were harsh, and central heating was a fantasy centuries away. Even lords in their feather beds sometimes wore caps and stockings to bed. What chance did you have without oak above and stone beneath to sandwich a little warmth around you? And the floors? Stone may look grand, but lie on it for more than a few minutes and it steals the heat straight out of your bones. Some households scattered rushes across the floor, a kind of medieval carpet made of reeds or straw, often mixed with herbs like lavender or mint, to mask the smell of dogs and spilled ale. By the time you lay down at night, those rushes were trodden flat and half-rotted. You pressed your cheek against them, breathing in a faint perfume of herbs mingled with the less romantic aroma of spilled beer. The table overhead helped trap a bit of that smell and a bit of that warmth, making your corner a tolerable cave. Quirky detail. In some households, people swore that sleeping close to the hearth smoke hardened the lungs. Modern science might cough politely at that claim, but in the Tudor mind, a little smoke was healthy, a kind of seasoning for the chest. Of course, too much smoke and you'd wake hacking like a goose, so the clever ones angled themselves under the table where the smoke eddied less fiercely. You'd laugh to yourself, thinking, who needs a doctor when you've got second-hand oak-filtered smoke therapy? Privacy was impossible, but companionship was warmth. Bodies packed under tables like logs in a fire, radiating heat into each other's cloaks. Dogs joined in too, pressing their warm flanks against yours whether you invited them or not. Your little knot of sleepers created its own microclimate, a bubble of shared warmth beneath the boards, while frost traced patterns on the hall windows above. And then there was noise. The wind moaned in the chimney, the fire cracked, someone snored, someone else shifted, muttering in half-sleep. The table amplified it all like a drumhead above you. Yet the sound became oddly comforting. It was the music of survival, proof that you weren't alone in the cold. Better a hall full of grumbling, coughing sleepers than the silence of frost outside. So when you curl under that table, remember, it isn't laziness or humiliation, it's strategy. The table breaks the draft, the rushes cushion the floor, the bodies around you keep the cold at bay. You don't have central heating, or thick duvets, or hot water bottles. You have oak, stone, straw and each other. And somehow, against the odds, that was enough. You roll onto your side, careful not to bump the dog wedged beside you, and a thought creeps in. All this business of sleeping under tables wasn't just about warmth or convenience. It was about control. Tudor households thrived on order the way kitchens thrived on salt. Every corner of life, even sleep, was carefully arranged to remind you who was in charge and where you belonged. The Tudor obsession with hierarchy bled into architecture itself. Look around. The high table sits at the far end of the hall, slightly raised on a dais, its carved legs gleaming in the firelight. That's where the lord and his favoured guests dined, elevated both physically and symbolically. Every other table stretched lower down the hall in neat rows, each placement a visual diagram of rank. At night, when the hall transformed into a sleeping ground, that same structure lingered. Nobles retired upward to chambers, officials claimed side rooms, middling servants clumped together near the walls, and the lowest curled beneath the tables like punctuation marks under a line of text. Order persisted even after the candles guttered out. There's a historical fact often noted by chroniclers. Tudor etiquette manuals obsessed over where you sat, what you ate, and how you behaved, right down to how loudly you could chew. The same mentality seeped into rest. To sprawl out randomly in the hall, ignoring the invisible map of social placement, would have seemed as shocking as snatching the Lord's cup during dinner. Sleep wasn't a break from the hierarchy, it was an extension of it, a quirky tidbit. In some larger households, the steward or senior servant actually supervised where people laid down, like a choreographed ballet of blankets and bodies. Imagine a tired man at the end of the night, pointing under the table leg and saying, "You there, squeeze next to the bench. No, not that corner, that's the cook's spot." It was both absurd and efficient, a nightly roll call enforced by oak furniture. Historians still argue whether this level of micromanagement was common across all Tudor homes or only in wealthier estates, but the principle is clear. A servant's body was not their own. Even unconscious, you were arranged, aligned, slotted into place like cutlery after supper. To resist would be unthinkable. And there's a strange paradox here. Beneath the table, you gained a sliver of stability. You might be the lowest of the low, but at least you knew your place, and no one could mistake it. Your corner of floor was yours by custom. In a world where survival depended on knowing when to bow, when to serve, and when to keep your mouth shut, that certainty may have been oddly comforting. You could relax, not into comfort, but into predictability. Jokes whispered in the dark helped too. You might nudge your neighbour and say, "Well, at least the oak table doesn't argue about who snores the loudest." Or another might mutter, "Do you think if we behave they'll let us upgrade to under the bench next year?" Laughter, muffled into the rushes, gave you a fragile sense of rebellion within the cage of order. So here you are, snug but not free, arranged under the oak not only for practical reasons but because Tudor life demanded visible discipline. Even in dreams you were part of the machinery of hierarchy, your place mapped out like the seating chart of a feast. You might ache, you might cough, but you also fit neatly into a system that prized obedience above comfort. The table was your shelter, yes, but more than that, it was a nightly reminder that the Lord's power reached everywhere, even into the shadows where you closed your eyes. The fire spits and crackles, throwing light across the flagstones, and you notice how the shadows shift under the table, wrapping you in a sort of flickering cocoon. For all its discomforts, this position offered one crucial advantage: protection from the fire itself. A Tudor hearth wasn't a tidy little fireplace with a grate. It was a gaping stone cavern, large enough to roast entire beasts. Sparks leapt unpredictably. Embers snapped across the floor like fireflies gone rogue, and smoke curled into every corner of the hall. To lie out in the open was to risk a glowing coal landing in your hair, or worse, in your blanket. Under the table, though, you had cover. The thick oak legs acted as barriers, and the heavy board above caught stray sparks that sailed too high. The table cast a deep shadow where flames couldn't reach, a natural shield against the unpredictable moods of the hearth. Think of it as early fire insurance, except instead of paying a premium, you paid with a stiff neck. This arrangement also placed you near warmth, but not in its full blast. Too close to the fire and you'd wake sweating and choking, too far and you'd freeze. Under the table you found a middle ground, warm enough to drift off but protected from sudden flare-ups. Historians still argue whether this was intentional planning or simply a happy accident, but the effect was undeniable. The oak overhead, the stone beneath, and the firelight at your side created a triangular balance of heat, shelter, and safety. A quirky little tidbit pops up in records. Some servants deliberately angled themselves so they could watch the dying fire through the table legs, using the glow as a kind of natural nightlight. There's something oddly childlike about that image. Grown men and women, exhausted from grinding labour, comforted by the flickering glow as if it were a candle against the dark. And in truth, the hearth fire wasn't just warmth. It was a symbol of the household's life, the beating heart that must never go out. Sleeping where you could see it reminded you that the house itself was alive, and you were part of its breathing rhythm. Of course, smoke was unavoidable. Tudor chimneys were experimental at best, and often the smoke lingered low, stinging eyes and filling lungs. You coughed, wiped your nose on your sleeve, and muttered a curse too quiet for the steward to hear. But under the table, at least, the smoke flowed over your head more than into it. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than waking up coughing like a goose about to be stuffed for Michaelmas dinner. And here's a joke whispered in the dark. One servant might nudge another and say, "If the fire doesn't kill us, the smoke surely will." The other would reply, "Better to choke warm than freeze clean." Grim humour, yes, but humour all the same, and it helped pass the long night. There's also the question of smells, which nobody mentions in courtly romances, but everyone knew. The hall stank of meat grease, spilled ale, wet dog and smoke. The table, being wood, absorbed it all. Yet somehow huddled beneath you felt safer in that stew of odours. It was familiar, almost homely, like sleeping inside a giant roasting pan. Odd comfort, but comfort nonetheless. So the table's shadow wasn't just symbolic, it was practical protection. It gave you a buffer from sparks, a steadying glow from the fire, and just enough distance from smoke to let your body sink, however briefly, into rest. You might not call it a good night's sleep, but in the logic of Tudor survival, it was the best compromise you could hope for. And tomorrow, when dawn clattered in with ladles and orders, you'd be grateful you hadn't woken with a singed beard or a smoking blanket. The hall still smells of last night's feast. Goose fat, baked apples, a faint tang of ale drying in puddles where cups tipped too carelessly. As you tuck yourself tighter under the trestle, it strikes you how the very same tables served two utterly different purposes within a single day. By daylight they were the stages of ceremony, groaning with food, music and chatter. By nightfall, once the trenches were cleared and the cups washed, they became the rafters of your lowly bedroom. This constant transformation was the rhythm of Tudor life. A single hall had to perform all the tricks of a household: feasting space, courtroom, workplace, theatre, and finally dormitory. There were no neat division like modern houses with dining rooms here, bedrooms there. The Lord's table stood on its dais during the day, a throne of meat and bread. Then once the torches dimmed, the same structure sheltered snoring servants. You might even say the table was busier than any of you. It worked by day as a banquet altar, and by night as the ceiling of a human kennel. Imagine the chaos of the changeover. A feast could last until midnight. Meat hacked apart, trenchers soggy with the sauces, cups clattering as minstrels played. Servants ran to and fro, refilling jugs, clearing bones, scraping plates. Finally, the nobles retreated to their chambers, leaving behind a battlefield of crumbs, grease, and toppled cups. That's when you, exhausted, dragged your weary limbs not to a soft bed but to the very battlefield itself. You curled under the trestle with crumbs falling into your hair, maybe a stray chicken bone nudging your elbow. Romantic? Hardly, but to your aching body it was heaven compared to standing another hour. Historians still argue whether servants were a listam to clear every scrap before bed, or if they simply collapsed beneath half-clean tables. Some letters suggest that in poorer households, servants slept literally amid the leftovers until dawn cleanup. Others imply that wealthier homes insisted on spotless boards before anyone was allowed to drop down. Either way, you were never far from the smells of supper. If you dreamed of food, perhaps it was because goose drippings seeped into your cloak. Here's a quirky detail. Some records note that dogs often finished the cleaning for you. While you snored, the hounds sniffed, licked and gnawed at bones left behind, effectively polishing the floor around your head. You might wake to a wet nose nudging your cheek, a dog still searching for scraps in your hair. At least he's thorough, you might mumble, before shoving him aside to catch another hour of sleep. There's a certain poetry in how one space folded into another. By day, the hall displayed wealth and order. By night, it revealed labour and exhaustion. The great oak tables carried both images without complaint. If you were a Tudor servant, you quickly learned that nothing was permanent. Not meals, not rest, not even the table's purpose. The same board that supported roasted boar at noon supported your dreams at midnight. And when morning came, the cycle began again. You rose stiff, brushed crumbs from your tunic, and scrambled to reset the hall for another day's display. If your master inspected the place, he never thought about the snores that had rattled beneath the boards a few hours earlier. To him the hall was eternal, always ready for pomp, never sullied by the realities of servant slumber. But you knew the truth. You carried it in your aching back, in the soot on your cheek, in the crumbs that clung stubbornly to your cloak. So the under-table sleep wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It showed how Tudor life constantly transformed, how spaces and bodies were repurposed without pause. One hall, two realities. One table, two functions. One servant, two lives. Public labourer by day, private dreamer by night. Your ear rests against the rush-strewn floor, and in the quiet you catch something important. The creak of boots outside, the sudden bark of a dog, the rustle of movement. In Tudor England, night-time wasn't entirely safe. Thieves, drifters, or worse, might test a door or a window. Fires could catch, animals could break loose, even a rival household could stir trouble. To sleep alone, scattered and exposed, was to court danger. But to sleep together under the table, side by side, was to build a little fortress of bodies. Communal sleeping was as much about security as it was about convenience. With so many servants bundled under the tables, any disturbance echoed immediately through the group. One sleeper shifted, another muttered. Soon everyone was awake, a human alarm system ready to leap up if the master's silver was in peril, or if the hearth began to roar out of control. You were less a sleeper and more a sentry disguised in snores. Historians still argue whether this protective role was deliberately intended by masters, or simply a lucky consequence of overcrowded halls, but the effect was the same. The house was never truly empty. Even when the Lord and Lady slept behind curtains, the hall below thrummed with the presence of watchful, or at least half-watchful, bodies. Thieves thinking of breaking in might hesitate when they realised the hall floor wasn't bare stone but a patchwork of servants and dogs ready to rouse at the first misplaced footstep. And then there's the curious overlap with animals. The Lord's hounds weren't just pampered pets, they doubled as security systems. Under the tables, the dogs slept beside you, their ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. A dog's growl in the dark was enough to wake 10 servants, who would sit up like startled birds, eyes darting to the door. In that sense, you and the dog shared the same job description. Keep the house safe even while asleep. The dog got the bones, you got the bruises. There's a quirky anecdote from the period about a nobleman who boasted that his silver had never been stolen, because I sleep upon a chest, and my servants sleep upon the floor. In other words, he trusted not locks but people, human barriers layered between his wealth and the night. You may have groaned at the unfairness, but in truth his method worked. Burglars were less likely to risk tiptoeing through a hall bristling with half-awake servants who could shout, tackle, or at the very least make enough noise to alert the guard. But of course, not everything could be guarded against. Illness swept through shared sleeping spaces easily. One cough beneath the table became 10 by morning. Fleas, lice, and other unwelcome companions travelled from cloak to cloak. Privacy didn't exist, and in that closeness, even dreams seemed shared. You woke with your neighbour's elbow in your ribs and muttered curses that melted into weary laughter. "Better crowded than robbed," someone whispered, and you all agreed, pulling your cloaks tighter as if they were armour. Modern ears might find it strange, even laughable, but remember, safety didn't come from locks or alarms. It came from bodies, snoring, muttering, shifting in the dark. Every cough was a reassurance that you weren't alone. Every creak of the table above reminded you that the hall was alive, humming with the collective breath of the household. Beneath those oak boards you were not just hidden, you were shielded by community. So when you curled under the table, you weren't just seeking warmth or obeying hierarchy, you were joining a nightly vigil, a living defence against the uncertainties of the Tudor night. Your body was part of a wall, a barrier built not of stone but of loyalty, duty, and the unspoken promise that no master's sleep would be disturbed while you kept your uneasy watch. The night deepens, and as you shift your legs under the trestle you brush against something warm and furry. Of course, it isn't just humans who claim this cramped little space. The Lord's dogs are here too, stretched out in a sprawl of paws and tails, their bellies rising and falling in rhythm with your own tired breathing. In Tudor households, animals weren't neatly confined to kennels or barns. They shared the living space, and sometimes they shared the sleeping space as well. During feasts, these hounds lurked under the tables, waiting for scraps, snapping up fallen bones or licking grease off the rushes. By the time the servants slid underneath to bed down, the dogs simply refused to leave. Why would they? The oak roof above offered the same shelter to man and beast alike. So you ended up with a strange companionship, half cosy, half inconvenient. A warm flank against your legs might be a blessing on a frosty night, but a flea-ridden coat was less so. The blurred line between animal and human roles was striking. Dogs acted as guards, companions, and scavengers all at once, and you, their fellow tablemate, were part of the same ecology. A quirky tidbit from some household accounts suggests that it was not uncommon for a lord's favourite hound to be treated with greater indulgence than his lowest servants. A servant might be kicked awake for snoring, while the dog was allowed to snore as loudly as it liked. You could joke in the dark, "If only I had 4 legs, perhaps I'd get better treatment." The other servants might chuckle, careful to keep their laughter muffled under the oak. Historians still argue whether the mingling of humans and animals under tables was universal or just more common in lower households, but the evidence is clear that it happened. Great halls were noisy, dirty, and alive with creatures. Men, women, dogs, sometimes even pigs nosing for crumbs. Privacy and separation were luxuries reserved for the wealthy. For you, lying beneath the table with a hound's paw draped across your chest, survival meant adaptation. You learned to accept fleas as fellow tenants and to treat a dog's warmth as a gift, even if it came with a smell that could strip paint. There's something almost tender in the way humans and animals shared this nightly shelter. Both needed warmth, both needed protection, and both found it under the same oak planks. The table didn't care whether the bodies beneath it had fur or skin. It simply provided cover, a neutral roof for whoever claimed it. In a way, it was the most democratic piece of furniture in the hall. Lords sat upon it, servants slept under it, dogs snored beside them all, one piece of oak binding together a wildly uneven world. And you, as a servant, might find comfort in that blurred boundary. Perhaps you stroked the dog's ear as you drifted off, or perhaps you muttered complaints about fleas into the straw. Either way, you were companions in survival, huddled together against the cold, sharing a refuge carved from the same shadows. The hierarchy outside the table might be merciless, but under it, you and the dog slept as equals. 2 creatures grateful for warmth, protected by oak, dreaming the same dreams of food and safety. You shift again beneath the oak trestle, trying to carve out just a sliver of space that feels like your own. But of course the idea of personal space in a Tudor hall was laughable. Privacy, that prized modern luxury, simply didn't exist for servants. Your body was public property by day, and at night it was stacked, wedged and overlapped with others like spoons in a drawer. Think of it. You spend the whole day fetching, scrubbing, hauling and bowing, and when it's finally time to rest, you don't retreat to a quiet chamber with a door. You slide into the shadows under a table already claimed by 3 others, careful not to elbow the kitchen boy or kick the laundress. You learn quickly that comfort means not rolling into someone else's breath. The word privacy doesn't cross your mind at all. Historians still argue whether servants felt humiliation about this arrangement, or if it was so normalised they barely thought of it. To you it wasn't an indignity, it was life. Generations before had done the same, generations after would too. Sleeping under tables wasn't shameful, it was expected. Still, the lack of privacy shaped everything. How you spoke, how you dreamed, even how you related to others. Secrets were hard to keep when your neighbour could hear your every mutter and groan. A quirky detail crops up in period plays, where comic servants joke about being squeezed like herrings in a barrel when sleeping in halls. The humour was real because everyone recognised the image. To lie shoulder to shoulder, barely space to turn, was as much a part of Tudor service as carrying trenchers or scrubbing pots. You might even snort at the memory of last night's conversation, which consisted entirely of 3 servants competing to invent the most ridiculous snores. Privacy wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. Courtly lovers could retreat to chambers for whispers and trysts, but you? If you dared whisper sweet words to someone beside you, half the hall would overhear, and by morning it would be a running joke. Even your dreams weren't safe. Murmur the wrong name in your sleep, and it would become gossip before the rooster crowed. The table overhead acted almost like a lid on a box. You were crammed aside with others, voices and breaths bouncing back down. For some, that closeness bred community. For others, claustrophobia. You longed for a space that was yours alone, where no steward's orders or dog's tail invaded. But such spaces didn't exist for you. You belong to the hall, to the household, to the system, and so your only escape was inward. You closed your eyes, blocked out the muttering, and built a world in your mind. Maybe you dreamed of a feather bed, or of being so wealthy you could afford a room with a door. Maybe you laughed bitterly at the thought, then snuggled closer to your cloak and accepted the truth. Privacy was for lords, not for you. Still, humour kept you sane. Someone might whisper, "Careful, don't talk too loud, the oak will tell on you." Another would reply, "Good, let me tell the lord I'm dreaming of stealing his bed." The laughter, smothered under sleeves, made the lack of privacy bearable. So under the table you found no solitude, no sanctuary, but you did find camaraderie. Your life wasn't yours alone, it was shared, overheard and overlapped. The Tudor hall left no room for privacy, but it did leave room for companionship, whether you liked it or not. Your cheek presses against the cool rushes, and through a gap in the oak legs you can see the high table looming above, the very symbol of wealth and status in Tudor life. It isn't just a slab of wood, it's a declaration. The carved edges gleam with polish, sometimes even painted or inlaid, a stage upon which the Lord's importance is daily displayed. And here you are, lying directly beneath it, your weary body a silent punctuation mark to his grandeur. Furniture in the Tudor world was more than functional, it was theatrical. A table said, "This house is wealthy enough to host banquets." A bed said, "This family can afford linen, feather mattresses, and curtains to keep the draughts away." A chair with the carved arms announced that the sitter was a somebody, and you, the servant, reinforced those symbols by contrast. While the Lord's table stood proud in the centre of the hall, you turned its underside into a bedroom ceiling, invisible and ignored. Historians point out that Tudor homes were often surprisingly sparse. A few grand pieces of furniture carried most of the symbolic weight. A bed or table might even be passed down for generations, treated almost like heirlooms or portable thrones. The household revolved around them. To a visitor, the gleaming oak trestle meant hospitality, status, and order. To you, it meant a place to curl your spine and hope no boot kicked you awake. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some lords were so proud of their tables that they insisted they be dismantled and carried along when travelling from one manor to another. Imagine a caravan of servants hauling heavy oak boards across muddy roads, reassembling them at the next hall, only for you to bed down beneath the same familiar legs that night, as if the table itself was following you like a stern master. You might even joke in whispers, "No escape, the Lord's table haunts us in every county." From beneath, the view was less impressive. You saw not gleaming carvings, but dust, forgotten grease, and the occasional cobweb. It was a stark reminder that grandeur was only for those who sat above. You occupied the shadow world, the underside of status, where the table's magnificence turned into a roof of splinters. And yet there was symbolism in that too. Just as nobles displayed their authority upon the surface, servants embodied the hidden labour that supported it. The Lord's feast looked effortless only because you had scrubbed, cooked, carried, and finally collapsed under the same table. Even your sleep reinforced the hierarchy. Grandeur above, labour below. Historians still argue whether contemporaries recognise this symbolism consciously, but the arrangement was too obvious to ignore. So as you curl beneath that ornate oak, you aren't just in a drafty hall, you're inside a living metaphor. The table above glows with status, your body below absorbs the cost of keeping it polished. You might laugh at the absurdity. By day they show it off, by night I keep it warm. A bitter joke, perhaps, but one that captures the truth. In Tudor England, even furniture was part of the social script, and your nightly bed under the oak was a line you had no choice but to deliver. The hall grows quieter, the fire sinking into glowing embers, and yet you're aware of another layer of meaning in why you curl beneath the oak boards. Superstition. Tudor nights were never just dark. They were alive with spirits, witches, and whispered dangers that seemed to slip through keyholes and ride the cold air. Sleeping in the open was risky, not only to your body but to your soul. Wood, especially oak, carried an aura of protection. People believed it absorbed bad humours, repelled wandering spirits, and anchored you to something solid and safe. To tuck yourself under a table carved of sturdy oak was to shield yourself with nature's armour. Perhaps you didn't consciously think of it each night, but the comfort of timber overhead went beyond physical shelter. It was a barrier between you and the invisible world. Historians still argue whether servants chose their sleeping spots for these spiritual reasons, or whether practicality alone drove the habit. But Tudor culture was thick with beliefs about nighttime danger. Candle flames were watched closely for signs of spirits. Dreams were read as omens, and certain corners of halls were thought unlucky for sleep. To wedge yourself under a table was to tuck into a kind of sanctuary, a pocket safe from wandering forces, a quirky tidbit. Some households whispered that witches couldn't pass through oak. To sleep beneath an oak table, then, was a charm in itself. You might chuckle quietly at that, rolling onto your back and muttering, "If the witches can't get me, the fleas surely will." Your neighbour might stifle a laugh, grateful for the levity in the dim hall. And then there were ghosts. Every old house had them, or so people believed. Former lords, fallen knights, even kitchen maids who had met unfortunate ends. Spirits were thought to drift through halls at night. Servants claimed to hear footsteps when no one walked, or whispers when the fire was low. Under the table, pressed close to others, you felt braver. Alone on the floor, you might have convinced yourself the whisper of the rushes was a ghost. But under oak and beside friends, you found the courage to sleep. In this way, the table became more than furniture. It was a charm, a shield, a talisman of wood against the unknown. The thick slab above your head reassured you, reminding you that not every shadow carried menace. You might not trust the night, but you could trust the oak. So you curled tighter, pulling your cloak around you, and let the table's heavy presence lull you towards slumber. Practical shelter, yes, but also spiritual armour, keeping at bay the witches and whispers of a Tudor night. The rushes crunch faintly as you shift, and for a moment you realise that what you're doing, huddling under a table into the Great Hall, isn't just some peculiar Tudor quirk. It has roots reaching further back, into medieval traditions when halls weren't merely dining rooms but the very heart of noble households. Long before Henry VIII strutted through his palaces, retainers and servants in medieval castles and manors were already spreading cloaks across the floorboards of great halls, bedding down wherever space could be found. The Tudors, in many ways, simply inherited an older rhythm. The medieval Great Hall was a communal space by design. It was where the lord met his people, dispensed justice, and hosted meals that doubled as political theatre. At night, those same halls echoed with the snores of squires, retainers, and household staff. Privacy belonged to no one but the lord. The tradition of sleeping in shared spaces trickled forward into the Tudor world, and the under-table nook became a logical continuation of that older communal practice. Historians still argue how much continuity there really was. Did Tudors consciously preserve medieval customs, or did necessity just keep dictating the same solutions? What's certain is that the culture of sleeping in shared halls wasn't new. What was new was the Tudor obsession with display, carving finer tables, building grander halls, and, ironically, making the space under those tables seem all the more ironic as servant shelter. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval records mention squires sleeping fully armed in great halls, their swords and shields resting beside them, ready to serve their lords at dawn. By the Tudor era, swords were less likely, But the idea of being always ready survived. Where once a squire kept watch for battle, a Tudor servant kept watch for the chamber pot, or a midnight craving for wine, you could joke that the job had softened not from war to peace, but from swords to sausages, and there's continuity in the architecture itself. Medieval halls were vast, draughty and smoky, just like their Tudor descendants. Rushes scattered on the floor, hounds prowling for scraps, the great hearth roaring at one end, it all carried forward. If you were a servant in 1480 or 1580, your nightly view was strikingly similar. Rafters above, oak beside you, and a cluster of weary bodies snoring in chorus. By connecting Tudor under-table sleep to older hall culture, you see the lineage of necessity. The nobility may have draped themselves in velvet, but they carried with them a medieval mindset. The hall as a living, breathing body, where everyone's role, whether sitting at the dais or curled beneath the oak, was visible and enforced. You didn't just belong to the household by day, you were literally enfolded into its architecture at night. So as you press your head against the cool wood and drift off, remember, you're part of a tradition centuries old, stretching back through medieval castles and beyond. What feels like indignity today was simply continuity then, a rhythm as ingrained in the household as feasting and prayer. You aren't merely a Tudor servant sleeping under a table, you're the latest echo in a much older chorus of bodies sprawled across stone floors, keeping the household alive through the long, uncertain night. Your eyelids droop, but before sleep carries you away, another truth presses in. You're not just lying under the table for shelter, warmth, or tradition. You're also there because you yourself are a part of the household's alarm system. Tudor servants were expected to be living instruments of time, the rough equivalent of modern alarm clocks. Except instead of a cheerful ringtone, it was a weary boy poking your ribs at 3 a.m. Every household had its rhythms. Fires had to be stoked before they died, bread needed kneading long before sunrise, and animals had to be fed before the day's bustle began. You, huddled under the oak, were perfectly placed to spring into action at odd hours. The steward knew where to find you, right there in the hall, half asleep, ready to stumble toward the hearth at his command. No time wasted chasing you down some distant chamber. Historians still argue whether every servant truly functioned as a human alarm clock or whether this duty fell mostly on a rotating few, but accounts are clear that someone was always nudged awake to keep the house running. The great oak tables, then, were more than sleeping shelters. They were docking stations, where the workforce could be summoned on cue. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some households, the designated waker was chosen for his loud voice or irritatingly cheerful morning demeanour. He'd crawl along the line of sleepers, whispering, nudging, or occasionally pulling off blankets to rouse his comrades. Imagine being shaken awake by your friend muttering, "Up with you! The bread won't knead itself." It was annoying, but at least predictable. You could joke, "Better him than the hounds, licking our faces awake." And there were tasks even stranger. Some servants were expected to wake at intervals through the night just to ensure the coal still glowed in the hearth. If the fire went out, the entire household would wake shivering, and the blame would fall squarely on the unfortunate sleeper who had failed in his duty. So you learned to stir at the faintest whisper of the steward's boots, to leap up with bleary eyes and poke the embers until sparks rose again. Your dreams were interrupted, but at least your reputation was intact. This constant readiness reshaped your sense of time. Nights weren't stretches of peaceful rest, but fragments, broken into bursts of dozing and sudden jolts of duty. You lived in a cycle of interrupted sleep, half alert even while dreaming. And you weren't alone. Everyone under the table existed in this same half-world, caught between slumber and service. Modern listeners might sympathise. Ever fallen asleep only to wake to a phone buzzing with a work email? Imagine that, but the phone is your master's voice booming from the dais above, and the notification is an order to fetch ale at midnight. Same principle, fewer emojis, so as you curl under the oak, you know you're not merely resting, you're waiting. You're the living mechanism of the Tudor household, a body set to wake whenever duty calls. Your breath may deepen, your eyes may close, but part of you always listens for the cough, the footstep, the dog's growl that will rouse you from half-dreams back into labour. You're not just a servant. You are the household's alarm clock, ticking quietly under the table until someone decides to ring. The faintest grey creeps through the high windows, and suddenly the hall is alive again. Dawn doesn't arrive gently in a Tudor household, it crashes in like a noisy kitchen ladle. Before the cock crows twice, the steward is already barking orders, and every servant who spent the night under the trestles must scatter, vanishing like shadows before the lord or lady stirs. This is the morning ritual of clearing away. You, stiff and groggy, push yourself upright, brushing crumbs and straw from your cloak. Around you, the whole hall erupts in a clumsy ballet. One servant drags benches back into line, another sweeps last night's rushes into piles, while a kitchen boy scurries with a bucket to douse the embers. Within half an hour, the evidence of your slumber must be erased. By the time the gentry descend for breakfast, the great hall must look pristine, as if no one had ever curled beneath those tables. It's a curious contradiction. The tables, heavy with symbolism, were never supposed to show the wear of servant life. They existed to dazzle guests, to gleam under candlelight, to stage spectacles of meat and music. So your body, which had depended on them for shelter, had to be erased from memory each morning. Historians still argue whether this ritual cleanup was strictly enforced everywhere, but accounts of grander households suggest it was routine, servants scrubbing away every trace of their nightly presence, as though even their dreams were disposable. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some reports mention that servants rose before dawn not only to clean but to air the hall, opening doors to let the smells of stale ale, smoke and bodies drift out into the chilly morning. Imagine being shaken awake at 5 a.m, not to eat or rest, but to ensure the room didn't reek when the Lord's guests appeared. You'd groan, rubbing your eyes, muttering, "Perhaps if he slept here once he'd know what stinks." The joke would earn a muffled snicker before the steward hushed you all back to work. There was a choreography to it, unspoken but precise. Blankets and cloaks rolled up and carried off to storage. Dogs nudged awake and herded toward the yard. Ashes swept, candles snuffed, trestles straightened until the hall regained its daylight dignity. By the time the master appeared, the servants were invisible again, busy in kitchens, stables or laundries, while the hall shone as if untouched by human exhaustion. And yet, for you, those morning moments were strangely precious. Shared yawns, whispered jokes about who snored loudest, playful shoves as you scrambled to hide the evidence. It was a fragile camaraderie built in the margins of duty. You were part of a hidden cycle: work, sleep, erase, repeat. By day the hall was theirs, by night it was yours. By dawn it belonged to no one, hovering briefly between worlds before order snapped back into place. So as you stagger from under the table, rubbing a sore hip, you know the game by heart. You were welcome to lie beneath the oak, but you were never meant to leave a trace. Your body was useful at night, invisible by morning. The hall itself demanded the illusion of timeless grandeur, and your presence, like crumbs brushed into rushes, was swept into silence before the sun climbed high. Your eyes are heavy, but as you stretch out the stiffness in your back, you recall that people in Tudor times didn't just live this reality. They wrote about it, joked about it, and even put it on stage. The curious sight of servants sprawled under tables seeped into the culture's plays, letters, and casual observations, leaving behind glimpses of how the world saw your nightly quarters. Take the theatre, for instance. Playwrights of the late 16th century often used the image of weary servants nodding off in corners or curled on the floor as comic relief. Audiences recognised it instantly, laughing at characters who muttered about being kicked awake or drooled into the rushes. It was funny because it was true. Anyone who had stepped into a great hall at night would have known the sight of bodies piled under trestles like so many discarded cloaks. Literary records sometimes hinted at the discomfort too. Letters survive from travellers describing the poor serving folk laid like dogs beneath the boards. Some writers expressed sympathy. Others treated it as simply another curiosity of English household life. Historians still argue whether these accounts exaggerated for effect or offered genuine glimpses of everyday reality. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a mix of hardship and humour, dignity and indignity, depending on the household. And then there are the comic tidbits. One anecdote tells of a master stumbling through the hall after too much wine, tripping over a servant who had made himself too comfortable under the table. The next morning, the poor fellow became the butt of household jokes for weeks. You can almost hear your own companions whispering, "Careful, don't stick your feet out or you'll be tomorrow's comedy." Laughter, even when sharp, softened the rough edges of the nightly squeeze. There's also a curious symbolic layer that writers picked up on. Some moralists use the sight of servants sleeping under tables as a metaphor for humility, even obedience. They saw it as a picture of the proper order of things, lords raised high, servants beneath. Others, however, hinted at its absurdity, suggesting that noble grandeur depended on the silent, unseen suffering of the many who slept in shadows. The debate remains unresolved, but the very fact that it made its way into literature shows how striking the image was. For you, though, it wasn't metaphor or comedy, it was life. You rubbed your eyes at dawn, shook straw from your cloak, and wondered if some poet upstairs was turning your aches into clever verses. You might mutter to your neighbour, "If I end up in a play, I hope at least they let me sleep through the first act." Another servant might laugh, whispering back, "Don't worry, you'll snore so loud they'll hear you in the pit." So beneath the oak, your life was not invisible after all. It echoed in plays, letters, and jokes, a reminder that the world outside noticed the oddity of your nightly bed. You were both unseen and represented, anonymous in life yet vivid in culture. That table above you wasn't just wood, it was a stage, and your weary body beneath it was part of the script of Tudor society, remembered in fragments of ink and laughter. The hall is hushed again, and as you lie with your head tucked close to the oak leg, another thought nudges you. Historians don't quite agree on how universal this practice really was. Did every servant in Tudor England sleep under tables, or was it just a vivid detail noticed in certain households and then exaggerated by later writers? The truth, like the straw under your cheek, is a little messy. Some argue that under-table sleeping was commonplace in large manors where bodies overflowed the available space. With dozens of workers but limited chambers, the hall itself became a dormitory, and the tables provided ready-made shelters. Others suggest it was more situational, that servants only resorted to this during feasts, when guest numbers swelled and every bed was claimed. Historians still argue whether the under-the-table image was a nightly reality or an occasional necessity turned into a cultural shorthand for servant hardship. Then there's the matter of social commentary. Contemporary chroniclers sometimes leaned into exaggeration for effect, painting vivid scenes of halls littered with snoring servants as a way to contrast noble comfort with common struggle. Was every servant truly curled beneath an oak slab? Or did writers simply find it a convenient metaphor, a symbol of hierarchy made visible in wood and flesh? The debate continues in dusty journals, and no two scholars quite agree. A quirky tidbit comes from foreign visitors to England in the 16th century. Some wrote with astonishment about how the serving folk bed here from the very hall where they eat, implying that the practice struck outsiders as unusual, even uncivilized. Yet, to the English themselves, it may have been so ordinary that it barely merited comment. Your nightly crawl under the trestle was less a scandal than a shrug, a fact of life unworthy of fuss. And of course, we can't ignore the possibility that some households simply handled it differently. Wealthier estates may have had lofts or galleries for servants, while poorer ones likely made do with any available corner from stables to kitchens. The under-the-table trope may be true in spirit, but variable in practice, just as some modern clichés capture a truth without being literal. Still, whether universal or occasional, the image persists because it speaks to something deeper. It encapsulates the Tudor world's relentless layering of rank. The lord at the dais, the steward in his chamber, the servant under the board. It crystallises in one snapshot the imbalance of wealth and comfort, and the resilience of those who endured it. Even if some nights you might have found a bench or corner instead, the shadow of the table remains the most enduring symbol. So as you lie there, aware that your life may one day be debated by scholars squinting over parchment, you let yourself grin at the irony. "If they argue about where I slept," you might whisper, "I hope at least they admit I snored." The laughter of your companions would ripple softly in the dark, joining the centuries-long chorus of voices, puzzled, amused, or indignant about whether servants really made their beds in the shadows of oak. The oak planks above your head feel eternal, but the world outside England had its own ways of dealing with servants' number. If you could peek beyond Tudor borders, you'd find that the habit of sleeping under tables wasn't quite as common elsewhere, though the same problems, crowded households, draughty halls, and rigid hierarchies existed all across Europe. In France, for instance, large chateaux often tucked their servants into garrets, lofts, or side chambers. French visitors to England sometimes raised their eyebrows at the sight of under-table dormitories, writing in letters that the English seemed careless of dignity when it came to their lower ranks. Better, in their eyes, to have servants climb a narrow ladder to an attic than to sprawl in the very room where nobles feasted. Historians still argue whether this was truly more dignified or simply more vertical. After all, a draughty garret wasn't much warmer than a draughty hall. Spain's grander houses, particularly in noble cities like Toledo or Seville, often used courtyards and adjoining servants' wings for nightly rest. Servants sometimes slept on mats in open-air spaces, trading the smoke of English halls for the chill of stone patios. A quirky tidbit: some Spanish households even assigned servants to sleep near the family chapel, so that they doubled as both caretakers of sacred space and living security guards for holy relics. You might mutter, "At least under a table I do not have to share with saints." Italy, with its palazzi and merchant mansions, leaned towards storing servants in cramped mezzanine rooms above kitchens or stables. The heat from fires and animals kept these spaces warm, if not exactly fragrant. The image of a servant sleeping with a horse nickering nearby is no less humbling than your under-table nook. But at least the Italian servant didn't wake up with candle wax dripping into his hair. Comparisons highlight how English hall culture clung to older medieval patterns longer than much of Europe. While continental households gradually shuffled servants into distinct quarters, Tudor England kept the Great Hall alive as a multi-purpose stage. You, the under-table sleeper, were as much a part of the hall's life as the tapestries on the walls or the smoke curling to the rafters. It's tempting to think of the English as especially harsh for making their servants sleep under furniture, but that would be too simple. Everywhere in Europe, the lowest ranks endured nights of discomfort. Whether wedged in a loft, sprawled in a stable, or curled under a trestle, servants shared the same fate, being always on hand, always visible, and always secondary to the household's display of grandeur. So as you curl tighter beneath your oak canopy, you can imagine a French boy shivering in an attic, a Spanish maid on a cold stone floor, an Italian groom nodding off beside a restless horse. Different tables, different corners, but the same truth. Service meant surrendering comfort wherever you laid your head. The candle gutters low, and as the last of the embers fade, you sense that even this peculiar tradition of sleeping under tables would not last forever. Tudor life was a world in flux, old medieval habits giving way to new fashions, new architecture, and new notions of what a household should look like. Over time, the servants' nightly crawl beneath the oak became less common, replaced by chambers, lofts, and eventually entire servant wings. As the 16th century tilted into the 17th, wealthy families expanded their houses. No longer was the Great Hall the all-purpose space it had been in medieval times. New designs carved out parlours with drawing rooms and galleries. Servants, too, were gradually pushed into more defined quarters, garrets under the eaves, long dormitories above kitchens, even purpose-built wings tucked discreetly away. The oak table remained the centrepiece of feasting, but by dawn it no longer doubled as a ceiling for exhausted bodies. Historians still argue about how quickly this shift happened. Some say the change was swift among the elite, with Jacobean architecture ushering in a new order of privacy. Others believe the humbler manners clung to hall sleeping traditions well into the 17th century. Servants still curling under trestles out of necessity long after it had gone out of fashion among the wealthy. Whatever the pace, the trend was unmistakable. Separation replaced sharing, privacy replaced community, and beds slowly trickled down the hierarchy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Inventories from the early Stuart period show an increase in servants' bedsteads listed in outbuildings or garrets. In other words, someone was finally spending money on the comfort of those who had once been content or resigned to sleep like dogs beneath the hall's furniture. You might joke, rubbing your sore hip, "I was born too early, another 50 years and I might have had a straw mattress all to myself." Of course, not all servants welcomed the change. Some found the dormitories lonelier than the crowded warmth of the hall. Under the table you had the security of numbers, companions to laugh with, hounds to keep you warm, and the faint glow of the fire nearby. In a garret you were isolated, cold, and far from the centre of the household's heartbeat. Progress, it turns out, could feel less cosy than tradition. Still, the direction of history was clear. As households modernised, the Great Hall lost its role as the nightly dormitory. The Lord's authority was no longer displayed by a chorus of snores beneath oak boards, but by architecture itself, grand staircases, private rooms, and clear separations between master and servant. The under-table sleepers faded into memory, immortalised in jokes, plays, and the occasional scandalised visitor's letter, but no longer part of the nightly rhythm. So as you stretch beneath the oak one last time, you're part of a vanishing world. Tomorrow's servants will have garrets and dormitories, however draughty. But tonight, you remain under the trestle, a remnant of a tradition centuries old already on the cusp of disappearing. You yawn, pulling your cloak tighter, and a stray thought drifts in. Funny, isn't it? How some things never quite change. In Tudor times, you were expected to be constantly available, to sleep under the table so your master could summon you with a cough. Centuries later, people still joke about sleeping on the job, nodding off at a desk, or catching a nap during a long shift. The furniture might be different, the technology fancier, but the demand to be always ready feels hauntingly familiar. Think of the parallels. Your Tudor master expected you under the oak trestle at night. Your modern boss might expect you to answer emails at midnight. One is a barked order in the hall, the other a buzzing phone on the nightstand, but both tug you out of rest, reminding you that your body and time aren't fully your own. Historians still argue whether under-table sleeping was a mark of servitude or simply practicality, but in either case the lesson carries forward. Those at the bottom rarely got uninterrupted sleep. A quirky tidbit to lighten the mood. There are stories of servants actually snoring so loudly under the tables that nobles upstairs complained. The steward would then scold the poor culprit, forcing him to snore more politely. Fast forward to today, and you might chuckle at a co-worker dozing at their keyboard. The same absurdity in a different costume. Human fatigue, it seems, is timeless. Of course, there's also the social irony. Just as lords flaunted their grand tables while ignoring the weary bodies beneath them, modern workplaces sometimes tout nap pods or wellness perks, while employees still sneak catnaps in break rooms. Furniture as status symbol, furniture as shelter. It's a cycle that repeats, from oak trestles to office desks. So as you curl once more under the Tudor table, you sense that your plight isn't merely historical. It's part of a longer story about labour, exhaustion, and the small corners humans claim for rest wherever they can. Whether under oak beams, in attic garrets, or on commuter trains, the world keeps demanding wakefulness, and you keep snatching sleep where it's offered. A Tudor servant or a modern worker, different centuries, same weary joke. The embers have sunk low, the dogs have stopped twitching in their dreams, and the oak table above you creaks softly as if settling into the silence. This is the moment when reflection comes easiest. When you realise that your nightly bed under the trestle wasn't just about cold stone, barking orders, or even survival. It was about what it meant to live at the bottom rung of a world obsessed with hierarchy, and how even your dreams were shaped by the furniture of your masters. The oak board sheltered you, yes, but they also pressed down, reminding you that nobility dined in the light while you rested in shadow. The great hall that glittered with feasts by day became a dormitory by night, and your body was folded seamlessly into its architecture. You were warmth for the house, a watchdog against danger, a piece of human furniture stored neatly away. Historians still argue whether this practice was universal or symbolic, but the truth is clear enough. For countless servants, the underside of a table was as much home as they could claim. There were small comforts, companionship, the glow of the hearth, the protective aura of oak. There were irritations too, dogs snoring in your ear, fleas hopping across cloaks, smoke that never quite left your lungs. There was no privacy, no softness, no guarantee you wouldn't be jolted awake to fetch ale at midnight. And yet, beneath those tables, a kind of resilience took root. You laughed quietly with your companions, whispered jokes about fleas and nobles, and found ways to endure. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some visitors claimed servants preferred the hall to lonely garrets, because at least here, in the crush of bodies and the flicker of firelight, they felt part of the household's pulse. Progress might eventually give you a straw bed in a cold attic, but progress wasn't always kinder. Perhaps, after all, there was a strange comfort in being tucked beneath the same boards that held the Lord's feast. And so the story circles back. From medieval halls to Tudor manors, from oak trestles to modern offices where people nap at desks, the human search for rest has always been improvised, uneasy, and shaped by power. Tonight you've traced that history step by weary step, and in the flickering shadows you can almost hear the chorus of centuries, servants, dogs, neighbours, all breathing together under tables long since vanished. Now the hall grows still, the fire fades to ash. The oak above you looms heavy but not oppressive. It's a ceiling that has for one more night kept you safe. You let your eyes close, knowing dawn will rattle you awake, but for this moment you rest, folded into the rhythm of a world that demanded much and gave little. Under the table you belong both to history and to sleep. And now, as the last sparks die into a soft red glow, the hall begins to empty from your imagination. The oak beams, the rushes underfoot, the muffled snores of servants and dogs, they all drift away like smoke curling upward into the rafters. What remains is only the gentle rhythm of breathing, yours and the world's slowing together. You can picture the tables still, their weighty planks carved and polished, standing skins after centuries of service. Once they bore feasts, once they sheltered weary bodies, and now they wait only in memory. The noise of the Tudor household fades. No more clattering trenchers, no more barking orders, no more shuffling servants rising stiff at dawn. All of it softens, like a candle's glow dwindling into the shadows. As you breathe out, you can imagine yourself slipping free of the cold stone floors, floating instead into warmth and quiet. The draughty hall closes its doors, the flicker of fire gives way to stillness, and your body feels lighter with each breath. Every detail, the oak above, the hounds beside, the laughter whispered in the dark, becomes a distant echo, fading gently until only calm remains. The world slows with you. Thoughts loosen, scatter and dissolve. You are no longer under a table, no longer pressed by duty or draft. You are safe, weightless, resting exactly where you are. Let your body sink into the softness around you. Let your mind wander no further. The journey is done, the hall is silent, and you are already slipping into sleep.